This week's Torah portion covers Exodus 1:1 to 6:1. The parashah is called Shemot, which in Hebrew means names. For anyone joining us for the first time, we are following the Jewish Bible reading calendar. The first 5 books of the Bible are divided into weekly reading installments, and we will read through them all in a year. A few minutes each Friday, I offer little nuggets and commentary about the text. It's not a traditionally Christian way to study the Bible, and it's not completely Messianic either. So for that reason, I call it Messianic Lite. I recommend to read the Bible chapters yourself each week so it can be a richer experience, and it will put the thoughts I'm sharing in context. Exodus begins with a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph coming into power. The first word out of the new Pharaoh's mouth are, "Look, the Israelites have become too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them." The Pharaoh comes to fear the Hebrews because of their accelerated growth. Goshen no longer hosts just Jacob and his descendants. That generation has passed away. But the Bible states laconically the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful, and the land was filled with them. They have grown into a nation, a foreign nation within a nation. Pharaoh worries that the Hebrews will become so numerous and strong that they will be a threat to Pharaoh's power. Pharaoh said, in case of war, they might join our enemies. We know from the Exodus story that from the moment the fear of the Jews began to fester in Egyptian hearts, things do not go well for the people of Goshen. Infant murder, oppression, and slavery are coming. But why does Pharaoh fear a farming people living separately? The Hebrews have not rose up in revolt. They are not plotting insurrection. They are trying to work and worship their God and maintain their morals and peace. The principal accusation is only that they are having too many children. But we know from Egyptian history that if Pharaoh seems overly paranoid of foreigners, he in fact did have understandable reason for it. In the 18th century BCE, a group of foreigners that ancient records call the Hyksos migrated into Egypt. The ethnic origins of the Hyksos are really unknown. Possibly they were fleeing drought in Canaan just like Jacob's family. Or they were Asiatic traveling merchants who ended up settling in Egypt. From what we can gather, the Hyksos didn't stage a dramatic coup. Instead, they targeted power vacuums and gradually infiltrated the Egyptian dynasties, eventually taking over their own chunk of the Nile Delta. Their political and military occupation lasted for 150 years. The Hyksos had horses and chariots and better weapons than the Egyptians. That partially accounted for their success, but their strength also came in numbers. It wasn't until 1550 that the Egyptians organized an anti-Hyksos revolt and successfully expelled the foreign rulers. Fast forward 100 years or so, when Pharaoh noticed the Israelites growing to a threatening number, the memory of the Hyksos was still very fresh. So the Egyptians feared the Israelites would become their next oppressor, or their next fifth column. Even if that thought was untrue, the Egyptians had grounds for the fears. That may have had something to do with an unusual command from God that comes up later, well after the Exodus in Deuteronomy 23:8. God said, "Do not despise an Egyptian, because you were strangers in his land." On Passover Seders, Jews celebrate their freedom and delivery from slavery at the hands of Pharaoh. However, one tradition in the Passover Seder makes sure that the plagues are never celebrated themselves. The suffering of the Egyptians is recognized. 10 drops of wine are counted out from the wine cup to symbolically empathize with the Egyptians innocent of Pharaoh's obstinance. Counting out the plagues recognizes the grief and suffering that came to ordinary Egyptians in the course of the Israelites' deliverance. That tradition likely comes from the verse in Deuteronomy. It is easy to hate Pharaoh when reading the Exodus story. He makes a very convincing villain. But we need to also remember that Egyptian angst over growing foreign minorities was somewhat understandable, if still not justified. And as the Bible says, the Egyptian is not to be despised. Israel was always meant to be a foreigner in that land and return to the land God had promised them. It was God orchestrating the events leading up to the Exodus. And according to Deuteronomy, it is God that has the authority to forgive the Egyptian. Isaiah speaks prophetically about God's love for Egypt and end-time promises of peace for the nation. Isaiah 19 says, "Thus the Lord will make himself known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day. They will even worship with sacrifice and offering, and will make a vow to the Lord and perform it. The Lord will strike Egypt, striking but healing, so they will return to the Lord, and he will respond to them and will heal them." From the villains of Exodus to the foreign slave masters of Deuteronomy to the prophetic promises of favor in Isaiah, I would say that no other country in the Bible outside of the Promised Land follows such a storied path to redemption. To a country and to people in economic, military, and political turmoil, as I speak, I want to remind you of the words of Isaiah. Egypt's story isn't over. Shavua Tov. Have a good week.